Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Bloomberg's David Gura sits down with former Canadian Finance Minister and Liberal Party leader candidate Chrystia Freeland.
If President Trump follows through on this threat to impose 25% tariff across the board on Canadian goods, how should Canada respond?
Well, I think we should start responding today. I think that we should publish for consultation a retaliation list. I think it should be massive, right? It should be $200 billion. That's not saying that we retaliate at $200 billion, but giving us like a menu, like a smorgasbord of choices. And we need to publish it now because when President Trump says America first, I believe him. And I believe that he doesn't care that much if Canadian politicians are jumping around, banging our fists on the table, etc. But he cares about Americans. And I want Wisconsin dairy farmers to see themselves on that list and to be calling the White House and to be saying, Mr. President, we elected you, but now it's going to be terrible. We're not going to be able to sell stuff to Canada. I want Michigan blue-collar workers who make washing machines in Michigan to see their washing machines on the list and to call up the White House and say, Mr. President, what the heck here? We love selling stuff to Canada. Do not do this. And the thing that I think can sometimes be missed, especially in how Americans think about this, is I think, if you will permit me, David, to put myself in the mind of Americans,
Yeah.
I think you guys don't think about Canada very much. I think when you think about Canada, maybe you think about hockey, maybe you think we're quite nice and we say please and thank you and probably we say sorry a little more than you guys would. And I just don't think you think of us as major players. And that is fine with us. But what you miss in that calculation about Canada is uniquely in the whole world, we have economic leverage over you. You guys are not a big trading nation, but insofar as you export stuff, you sell it to your Canadian pals. We are a larger market for the United States than China, Japan, the UK, and France combined. So actually, we do matter for you. And one thing that I love about Americans is you guys have a true entrepreneurial spirit and commercial spirit. You are the guys who say the customer is always right. Well, guess what? We're your main customer. And I think Canadians now need to be reminding not so much the White House, but all those great Americans who sell us your great American stuff. And I think what we need to be saying is, we love your stuff. You guys make great stuff. That's why we buy so much of it. And really, don't you want to keep selling it to us?
A criticism I hear of your approach is by doing this, by coming up with that menu or that long list, you're going to further raise the hackles of President Trump. You're kind of putting more of a target on your back. What do you say to those critics who argue that?
You know, I have a lot of respect for President Trump. I think he has been throughout his career underestimated. I think he is a really smart guy. And one of the things that I've observed is I think he's going to be smarter in this administration than he was in the first one. Have good relations, this may surprise you, David, with a lot of people close to the president. One of them actually was in my house here in Toronto for supper a few weeks ago.
Can I divulge who this is?
I'm not going to tell you. No, of course I'm not going to tell you. He won't come back for supper, right? But he said, the president has spent, since the election, weeks and weeks and weeks hanging out with really smart people. And he has some really good and clear ideas. So I take the president very, very seriously as a smart guy, actually with a clear world view. I also observe his negotiating style. And what I observe, which I think everybody sees, is this is not a guy for whom weakness is attractive. I would say for President Trump, weakness is a provocation. I think capitulation is not a negotiating strategy with him. This person close to the president said to me, this was before the inauguration, he said, Trump thinks it's just great. He's going around yelling at the world, threatening the world, and countries are just tripping over themselves to like pre-concede. They're negotiating with themselves. He's not even president, and they're offering him a million things. And the president, quite rightly, by the way, thinks this is great. He hasn't done a single thing, and the world is tripping over itself to give him stuff. Now, I truly believe that Canada and the United States today have a really fabulous, mutually beneficial, win-win productive relationship. And I think we need to and should have that in the future. No less a president than Ronald Reagan described our relationship as the best, most productive relationship over a long period of history of two countries in the world. So I think a win-win is possible, essential. But I think the way you get there, generally in life, but particularly with this president, is to say to him, you know what, really pushing us around is not a good idea. And critically, what we need to be doing is getting people in the United States to understand that. Because I also really understand, and I respect this about the president, the people he listens to the most are Americans. So the people he's going to listen to, David, are your listeners. What Canada needs to do is make the case to American exporters. Make the case to American business leaders, people who are watching the stock market, as President Trump does very carefully, that actually you have a great relationship with Canada. Why would you want to mess that up?
Can I ask you what may be a dumb-sounding question, and that is...
There are no dumb questions.
Thank you. What does President Trump want? Here we are just a few days away from this February 1st deadline that he's put in place. He's talked a lot about traffic of drugs. He's talked about immigration. Do you have a clear sense of what would have to happen for him to forego putting those tariffs in place?
No, that is not a dumb question at all. It is an excellent question. And I am not going to presume to know what President Trump wants. I think that that is up to him and the very smart people around him to say. But based on past behavior, based on what we're seeing, I think President Trump is seeking to accomplish three things. First of all, he would just like Canada to negotiate with itself as much as possible, and he'd like us to ante up tons of stuff. So that's number one. I think number two, what President Trump is trying to do quite intentionally is create uncertainty for investors in every country other than the United States. He wants to make investors, when they're thinking about where do you put the next dollar, to think, we have no idea what President Trump is going to do. We know he wants us to invest in the U.S. We don't know what he's going to do to any other country. So what the heck? Let's put our money in the United States. And that is not a dumb strategy, right? Just by saying a few things on social media, you automatically suck capital into the United States. I think the third thing that the president wants to do is encourager les autres, as we would say here. And I think that, as Canadians, we think about Canada-US very much. But I know Americans, you guys don't wake up in the morning and think, hey, how's our relationship with the Canadians going? And President Trump, I do think, has a clearly elaborated and sophisticated worldview of what he wants to do. And it seems pretty clear to me that he has come to the conclusion that if he can show the rest of the world how mean and tough he can be with his closest partners and allies, how much he's prepared to beat up on those really nice Canadians who throughout history have been great partners for the U.S., how do you think that's going to make the Chinese feel? So I think there's that calculation as well. That's kind of on the tough guy side of things. But I do want to offer a positive opportunity that I think is in the president's mind as well. Maybe two positive opportunities, two positive exit ramps. The first one is I do think the president is very concerned about U.S. security, security for the USA, economic security, but also national security. And in that context, kind of locking down your neighbors, locking down your continent makes a lot of sense. Locking down your continent by saying, hey, Canadians, be the 51st state, I really want to assure you, my American friends and neighbors, it's not going to work. That is going to get our hackles up, and we're going to say a stronger no than you might ever imagine. But locking down your security by saying, hey, Canada, let's work together on continental economic and physical security, you're going to find everyone in Canada saying, yeah, we'll sign up to that. And that has been the Canadian choice throughout history. I mean, the whole reason Canada's a member of the G7 is because you guys said, we don't want to be alone with the Europeans. We want to have our Canadian pals with us. And where Canada feels our interests are aligned with the US, we are an outstanding partner. We can be your wingman. So on that kind of continental security point, we can be really helpful. And then I think there's a second exit ramp, a second win-win scenario that I believe Scott Bessent's confirmation as Secretary of the Treasury really opens up for the US and for Canada. Scott Bessent is an incredibly sophisticated global economic thinker. He is a man who has a very well worked out view of the global macro, not just environment, but the global macro system. And he is someone who spent his career thinking about moments when that system changes. In fact, you could say that his investing strategy has been figure out where the imbalances are and invest there.
Depending on that, yeah.
Figure out where the changes are going to be and invest there. And I do believe that it's right to point to there being global macro imbalances, which are a problem for the whole world, but particularly the US. The fact is, the global economy today is run based on the US consumer. It is run based on incredibly strong US domestic demand. And what that is requiring is that you guys run just like eye-popping fiscal deficits, which at a certain point surely are going to become unsustainable. In the meantime, China has been running, notwithstanding frequent protestations, this is going to change, an economic system that is based on selling stuff to the world and not having strong domestic demand. And China over and over again promises and fails to have strong domestic demand in China. I think it is entirely possible that the historic role that Scott Bessent has signed up for is to be the guy who writes those global financial and trade imbalances, a kind of Plaza Accords for our time. And Canada can be a valuable and intelligent partner for the US in the effort to rebalance the global economy. We're chairing the G7 this year. We get it. And that is where I see two kind of quite new and important win-wins for Team Trump that Canada can offer. So continental security, national and economic, help you guys with this great and essential project of rebalancing the global economy, of righting those global financial imbalances. But we can't do it if you keep beating up on us and like slapping us in the face.
A cornerstone of your campaign is you've had experience dealing with President Trump before. You know how he operates, you know his negotiating strategy, and I think we could both say this isn't the same playbook as last time. Maybe it's a revised version of it. He wasn't talking about subsuming Greenland or wresting control of the Panama Canal back or making Canada the 51st state the last time he was in office. I am curious how you watched what unfolded over the weekend. The president making a threat against Colombia, and in the span of really 9 hours, going from saying he was going to levy tariffs of 25 or 50% to removing them completely, and Colombia essentially folding in the face of that. What does that tell you about his tack, his strategy this time around?
Well, I look at it more from the Colombian perspective, and I would say never make a threat you're not prepared to act on. And so from the Canadian perspective, when we put retaliatory tariffs on the table, we as a country need to be fully prepared to act on them. And I think we are. I hope it doesn't come to that. I really, really do. And I think it would be better for Canada and the US not to come to it. So that's what it tells me from the Canadian perspective. What it tells me from the US perspective is unless you have leverage of some kind, the president is not going to care about you. And that's why what gives me such medium-term confidence about the Canadian position is we have leverage, and we have negative leverage. If you hit us, we uniquely, in the whole world, do have the economic capacity to hit back. And we also have positive leverage. There is a lot that we can offer you guys. And I think, like, broadly in the United States, I think Americans know that. Like, as we said at the beginning, David, Americans, I don't believe, spend a ton of time thinking about Canada. But I think when you think about Canada, you think our friends to the north. And I think, you know, if you want to pull back, and I do really think President Trump has been taking a true historical view of the U.S.
You do.
I truly do. I truly do. And I think he sees himself as someone who is president at a hinge moment in history, and he wants to take advantage of that. So if you take that kind of a perspective on the Canada-U.S. relationship, I think what you will see is the strength and the prosperity of the United States has, to a very significant degree, been based on the fact you've never had to worry about the North. You know, you have a 5,500 mile border with us. You never have to worry about it in a meaningful way. Compare yourselves to a European power, right, that has constantly in its history had to worry about its borders, had to worry about being invaded, had to worry about spending money for its own continental defense. You guys have never had to do that. And better yet, you've had a great economic relationship with those guys to the north. I mean, we haven't even talked about energy. Energy security is a critical element of national security. And if you doubt me, just ask the Germans, right? Building their economy based on cheap Russian gas has turned out to be a mistake of historic significance.
Is curbing energy on the menu that you would propose the government make?
I think we as a country need to be prepared to use all the tools in our toolbox. I also think that we need to have a strategy which is united, strong, and smart. So any measures we take, we need to have the home team together. One of the things I learned, I was trade minister for a while. I negotiated a trade deal with the EU, and we renegotiated NAFTA, which is President Trump's trade deal.
Very happy with it for a time.
He said it's the best deal in the world. One of the things I learned, taught by Canada's brilliant professional trade negotiators, is the most important thing in a trade negotiation is be sure the home team is aligned. And that is a real priority for me. Maybe of less interest to your American listeners, but here in Canada, the place I would start is getting us all on the same page, working together.
Well, let me ask you lastly about that before I move on to other topics. Do you feel that Canadians understand the gravity of this moment? And I saw the Bank of Canada was out with a projection that GDP could take a 6% hit if these tariffs go into place. You certainly know this Prime Minister well, have worked with him closely, and I wonder if you think that he and the government now is prepared to take the kind of hardline approach that you're advocating for here in the context of this campaign. Is your read that the government is approaching it with kind of a commensurate level of seriousness and I guess aggressiveness might be the word.
You started by asking me about Canadians,
Yes.
and I think that is actually the most important question. And I am absolutely certain that Canadians understand how serious this is. Like, I've been traveling around the country a lot. As you may have heard, we have a campaign for the leadership of the Liberal Party right now. So I've been traveling around a lot, and everywhere I go, people come up to me on the street, in malls, on airplanes, in airports, and the first thing every single person says is, what are we going to do with President Trump? And be sure to tell them Canada is not for sale. Our sovereignty is not negotiable. So I think Americans are going to find that Canadians are more deeply patriotic than you may expect. We are not a country that, tends to always wear our flag on our heart and wrap ourselves in the flag. But I think now is a moment when you're going to see us doing it, and you're going to see us doing it, more in sorrow than in anger. You're going to see us saying, guys, we actually like you. Let's keep a good thing going. But I think you're going to see a very, very deep Canadian commitment to saying, we are Canadian, and we are not going to sacrifice 1 millimeter of our sovereignty, including our economic sovereignty.
That's the Canadian side writ large. How about the government's position? How do you feel like they're approaching this, and is it sufficient enough in terms of its aggressiveness in the face of the threat from President Trump?
What I'm trying to do now that I'm a leadership candidate and not in the government is, I would say, help to stiffen the national spine. And I've been laying out some very clear negotiating ideas that we need to put forward, and I'm glad when I see them adopted by the government. I do have to say the premiers are playing a really important role. I'm in touch with many of them, and that has been a very important part of Team Canada. And I also want to give a shout out to labor leaders and business leaders. The way we succeeded in NAFTA 1 or in Trump 1 was by building a true Team Canada approach, which was premiers of provinces and territories across the country. It was business leaders, it was labor leaders, it was Indigenous leaders, and that's what we're going to have to do this time.
I want to ask you about the letter that you wrote resigning from your post. It had this kind of seismic effect, certainly within your party and government. We felt it in the States as well.
That's rare for a Canadian political event, isn't it? I heard a lot of people saying, wow, Canada, you're usually so boring. You've actually become interesting.
But
we're surprising ourselves by how interesting we've
been huge, and we're here talking in part because of that. Obviously, this campaign is a result of that. Did you know at the time it was going to have that kind of seismic effect that it did?
Oh, absolutely not.
No.
I mean, when I wrote my letter and published it, that was on a Monday, I assumed that on the Tuesday, Mark Carney would be sworn in as finance minister. And I think that's what the Prime Minister assumed too.
Something that was in that letter was an impression that you need to do more to keep your fiscal powder dry. As you look back on the last 2 fiscal years, do you regret not doing more to kind of shore up the fiscal position of this country?
Well, as you know, David, visiting us from the United States, Canada is in an outstanding fiscal position compared to you guys. I mean, you guys are looking at deficits 7+. We're looking at a deficit, 1 and a bit. And we have a AAA credit rating. Our debt to GDP ratio is the lowest in the G7, hugely lower than yours. So Canada, the fundamental fiscal position of Canada is strong. What I did believe in the fall, and this conviction became stronger first with President Trump's election and then with his 25% tariff threat, was that we had to, as a country, turn all of our attention to that threat. We had to recognize that President Trump was not just blustering. I'm one of the people who takes him very seriously and sees him as a very smart guy who has a thought out plan. That is what I saw then. That is what I see now. And so it was very clear to me that as a government, it had to be like heart and nerve and sinew, like everything had to be focused on that. And writing checks that would cost us $6 billion as this, train was coming down the track, to me was irresponsible.
You invoked Mark Carney a minute ago, and he's committed to balancing the budget, I guess with running small deficits from time to time. Are you prepared to also call for balanced budgets? And if so, on what timeline?
I believe that we need to be fiscally responsible, absolutely. I believe that Canada's AAA credit rating is absolutely essential. When it comes to, where our fiscal position is, let's see what happens on February 1st, because, and in the weeks to come. I do think when we talk about the impact of tariffs on Canada, I am medium term 1,000%, 1,000,000%, a Google percent, confident that that Canadians will stand up for Canada, that we will get through this, and we will get to a win-win position with the U.S. To me, that is absolutely clear because that's what the economic fundamentals say. But I am also not naive about how hard it's going to be along the way. This is going to be a very challenging economic situation for us. Tariffs will bring in revenues for sure. Our counter tariffs will, our retaliatory tariffs, and we need to use that money to support Canadian families, to support Canadian businesses. But it will be also an economic hit to Canada. And so I think we need to see where that goes before committing to any specific targets. It's just like with COVID, right? Like during COVID, we did the right thing as a country. We did spend money to support Canadians, to support Canadian families. And the result in Canada was an economy that came through it in much better shape than we came through the 2008 financial crisis, and actually a really strong public health response. If Canada had had US levels of mortality, an additional 70,000 Canadians would have died. That is the size of a Canadian city like Fredericton. That many people gone. So, yeah.
I have a couple of questions about revenues, and the first has to do with the capital gains tax hike that you introduced and supported. You've since come back on that. It's not something that you support putting in place now, I gather, because of the context we're in, Donald Trump being reelected, the prospect of these tariffs. Part of that was raising revenue. I gather 19 billion Canadian dollars over 5 years. How do you replace that if that doesn't come to pass?
So let me just start by saying, as I said about my views during the fall, I take President Trump really seriously. And I do believe we need to be building our policies given that new reality. I think as Canadians, by the way, we need to see some real opportunities in that new reality. So, there are some sort of hoary old chestnuts of Canadian public policy stuff that we all kind of know would be a good idea to do, but it's just so hard. So if you were a Canadian journalist, you would know interprovincial trade, the holy grail of every single Canadian public policy thinker. Very easy to say it's a good idea, hard to do in practice.
Difficult to say, period.
Yeah, there you go.
Interprovincial trade.
And easy to get the idea, right? Like if another country is threatening trade measures against us, maybe a good place to start is, let's trade with each other, for goodness sake. And so I think now, in the face of the U.S. threat, it's a great opportunity to do that. And I think you're really seeing some national will around that. I think it's a great opportunity to say, guys, we have to stop getting in our own way. We have to make it easier to build stuff fast in Canada. We have to cut red tape and get big projects built, because we're going to need it. So I do want to be clear that there are some opportunities. And, in terms of where are we going to find revenue, I'm not unveiling all of my platform here today with you, David, even though I am enjoying the conversation immensely. But we have some really good ideas that I look forward to sharing with Canadians.
There's a fiscal question about your about face on that particular tax. I think there's a larger question about the way that you advocated for it in months past. So you kind of couched it in moral terms. You had a message to the wealthiest people in this country that this was something that they had to do on moral grounds. There shouldn't be hungry kids going to school, for instance. For somebody who listened to you talking about it in that way and sees you moving away from it, what do you say if they question your kind of commitment to political principle because of that?
Income inequality and what Canadians might call a just society, a society where we take care of each other, has been a kind of central principle of my life and my thinking since I became a sentient human. Truly, like I come from a small town in northern Alberta. It's really, really cold. You're cold in Toronto today. It gets down to 40 below regularly in the winter. And people in the Peace Country, they are frontiersmen. My family were pioneers, very proud of that, very tough, very entrepreneurial. But like the patron saint of the Peace Country, his motto was, what people said about him was, he was every man's friend and he never locked his cabin door. And that is a very powerful thing that I've known since I remember knowing words. And I do think we have to take care of each other. I wrote a book about income inequality and sort of the rise of this global plutocracy and the hollowing out of the middle class before I entered politics. I'm really proud of the things I did in government to push against it. The Canada Child Benefit, a huge measure that has lifted Canadian families, Canadian children out of poverty. I spoke yesterday with an Afghan Canadian woman who's going to be running for the Liberal Party in the next election. And she told me how she came to Canada. She was married very, very young. She had 3 children. It was a difficult relationship. She left the relationship, and she said, I slept with my kids in our Honda Civic for nearly a year. And then and think about that. And she said, 1 kid on each seat, 1 kid on the back seat, and she said she slept where the feet are. And she's not self-pitying. She's now running as a Liberal candidate, okay? She has a good job, she's running. And she said, what made it possible for me and my kids to get out of the Honda Civic and for me now to be a candidate for the Liberal Party is the Canada Child Benefit. And she was just counting the days until she got that. So we have put some really, really good programs in place. I'm also very proud of the national system of daycare, $10 a day daycare. Great for families, great for allowing women to have a kid and have a job. Also a great driver of economic growth. So I believe in all of that. I also know that today for Canada, the most significant economic fact and reality is that Donald Trump is president with a plan to change the world. And we don't need to be afraid of that. We need to have a plan to deal with it. And we need to recognize the magnitude of the challenge. You know, John Maynard Keynes had this great line, when the facts change, I change my mind, sir. What do you do? And the difference between a United States with Joe Biden or Kamala Harris as president, both of them intended to raise the capital gains rate, versus a Donald Trump as president is huge for Canada. You know, we started off in the conversation talking about one of my sort of core understandings about Donald Trump. And that is that one of his objectives is take all the world's money. You heard that in the Davos speech, right? He was like, guys, invest your money in the United States, it'll be great. Invest your money outside the United States, it will be terrible. So he wants to suck in all the world's investment. He wants to suck in investment by Canadian businesses. And for Canadians, it's the easiest thing in the world to invest in the United States. So we right now have to fight. We have to fight for Canadian jobs. We have to fight for Canadian businesses. We have to fight for Canadian investment. And that does mean we have to change our policies. And I do that without any apology whatsoever. I do that because we have to put the national interest first.
Wrapping up here, let me ask you about the Liberal Party today, what it's going through, what this campaign represents, and I guess I'm bringing my bias to the table here, but thinking about what's happening within the Democratic Party in the United States after this election. Is it a fair parallel as they think about who their base of support is, who they represent, how big a tent they have? Are you and your party going through something similar undulations?
That is such an interesting question. You're the first person who's asked me that question, and I'm glad you have because I think about it a lot. And I do think for us as a party, having this leadership race is incredibly healthy. We are seeing a surge of new memberships in the Liberal Party. We are seeing a surge of interest. We're having conversations that we haven't had before. One of the things that I really believe we need to do, and I'll leave it to you to judge and your listeners whether Americans need to do it too, is where I think the right has been effective in recent months and years, is in finding ways to connect with its own grassroots supporters, in finding ways to make regular people feel that they were being listened to and that they were driving what the policies would be. I would say that our party had become less effective at that. I think inside our party, we had allowed the grassroots to atrophy. As a government, we functioned in a very kind of, star system, one-man band, decisions taken right at that apex and flowing down.
For years.
And that's not good for democracy. And, if I've been spending a lot of my time meeting with grassroots Liberal supporters and with Canadians who you might describe as Liberal curious. And, what I think, the hardcore Liberal supporters, what I've heard them say is, if the only time you talk to us is when you want us to write a check or knock on a door or put up a lawn sign, don't be surprised if we're disengaged. So I see this moment, certainly for us here in the political center in Canada, in the Liberal Party, as an opportunity to, with a huge amount of energy and conviction, reinvent how we are working as a party, to really listen to Canadians, to listen to Liberals, to say to them, you're the boss. You're the boss of the party. And to Canadians, you're the boss of the government. And these are kind of words that are easy to say. I think it's important to put in structures that make that the case. And so last week, I put forward some very specific proposals on reform of our party. One of them, maybe the most important one, is, I don't know about you, David, but a way to understand who your boss is to know who has the ability to fire you. And so what I have promised is, if I am chosen as leader, one of the very first things I will do is say to the party membership, I want you to come up with a mechanism for a leadership review. I want you to have the right and the tools to fire me. And I can assure you, when we give Liberal Party members that authority and that power, you will have a Liberal leader who is much, much more responsive to the grassroots of the party, and you will have a stronger and better party. And you know what? You will make Canadian democracy better.
Quick follow-up to that. Could term limits have solved this problem? Clearly that was something that was preventing the party from thinking about who would come next and when.
We are a strong and vibrant parliamentary democracy, and I don't think grafting features from a U.S. presidential system onto our own is really a good idea.
no.
But where I think you're driving at, I agree with, which is the leader cannot be the person who decides whether she or he continues in that role. We need to be sure the grassroots have much more authority than they have today. I think we need to be sure that caucus members have much more authority than they have today, which is how parliamentary democracies in the Westminster system work in other countries. So, and I do absolutely believe that it was wrong for the leader alone to be the person who decided whether he continued in government.
Just kind of in the time horizon of this campaign, I'm very curious how you'll go about differentiating yourself from your closest rival here. So I look at your biographies. Grew up in Alberta, went to Harvard, graduate school at Oxford, government service, time on the international stage. What are going to be the differentiators between you and Mark Carney going forward here?
Well, talking about, if we're going to start with the biography, I think there are some crucial differences. One is, I've been a politician, and politics is something that I think you need to, where experience helps. Margaret Atwood has this great line where at a dinner party, she was talking to a neurosurgeon, and the neurosurgeon said, I'm planning to retire soon, and then I want to write a novel. Do you have any tips? And she said, oh, that's so interesting, because I'm planning to retire from being a novelist, and I'm going to be a neurosurgeon.
Yeah.
Any tips for me? So, like, politics, it's a thing, and for sure, you get scars doing it, but you also learn stuff. And that particularly applies to dealing with other countries and dealing with tough negotiations. It is one thing to be a technocrat. It is one thing to be a bureaucrat, responsible only to your own bureaucracy and ultimately to your political masters. It is another thing to be an elected politician, responsible to your country and your citizens, and to go mano a mano with the tough guys of the world. That's something I've done. Canadians have seen me do it. And crucially, the tough guys of the world have seen me do it. So I would say that is an absolutely critical difference.
Last question. How determinative are these next few weeks going to be for Canada? Yes, in the context of this campaign, but as we're facing this February 1st deadline, in your letter you talked about the gravity of the moment. How do you see it in the context of history?
Huge. I think we are at a hinge moment for Canada and also for the world. I think this is a time when, that period, we had that, remember the end of history? Do you remember that? The end of history is now ended. And I would say even that rules-based international order that we built so painstakingly after the Second World War, I think that is being shaken up. The kind of peak globalization we had with China's entry to the WTO, that is being shaken up. So, the tectonic plates of the global political system and the global economy are shifting right now, and that matters for Canada. And at heart, the reason that I am running to be leader of the Liberal Party and the Prime Minister of Canada is I have a plan for how Canada can not just survive this shifting of the plates, but absolutely thrive as these plates shift, thrive because of things we do at home, but also thrive because I have a real vision of how this reordering can happen in ways that are good for Canada and good for the United States. And I know that that is something we can work on together.
That was Bloomberg's David Gura and former Canadian Finance Minister and Liberal Party leader candidate Chrystia Freeland. And this is Bloomberg.